Thank you everybody for being here. I mean, we do this quarterly and we're always thinking about what are the things that are most impactful to the construction industry and in Northern Colorado and what can we be talking about. I think this exit and succession planning in this changing construction industry. So it's kind of this title of what are we doing and what are we seeing? We experience other companies going through transition. We at our own company say, okay, what's leadership look like? What's exit strategy? What's transition? Whether you're new and trying to get into the company saying, what does that mean to me and what could my growth be? Or as a leader that's been there for a lot of years, where's my ceiling and is it part of ownership? And if not, that's okay. And what does that exit? How do we, from a cultural standpoint, a leadership standpoint, and as an owner, you know, a financial standpoint and a risk standpoint, how do we transition that smoothly? So I think we'll talk today with a really qualified panel about the different options, legal options. There's obviously tax and different things that go into that. But also, as an owner, are you ready for that transition? And what does that look like from a development of the people underneath you? And are you the person that, are you the business or is the business take care of itself? And so I think there's a lot of different topics that we're going to try and cover today. We talk about some statistics, and as far as 76% of businesses in Colorado are owned by baby boomers, and as that population ages out, and over the next 5 years, 49% nationwide of privately held businesses, which includes construction, will exit in the next 5 years, and then 60% in the next 10 years, business owners expect to retire or sell. So these are big statistics and big numbers that we should be talking about. And you could be a big general contractor, a mid-sized, small, or you could be a subcontractor. It affects everybody in what we're seeing. So these are some of the numbers that we've talked about. And private equity, we'll talk about ESOPs today, the different handoffs that can happen and what makes sense for each individual business is different. But the first thing we wanted to do, and one of the exciting ways to kind of kick it off, is to bring up someone that can tell a story of what a business ownership leadership transition looked like. So I'll bring up Brady and I'll hand him the mic. He's with Fiore & Sons as the CFO, and they went through one of these in the last 2 years, and he'll kind of go through what that looked like and how it felt.
All right.
Thank you, Brady.
Thanks. All right, I only prepared about 4 hours worth of material, so if you're good with that, there's coffee and water. I did bring up a few notes just so I'd make sure to cover everything. So as was mentioned, Nick mentioned I'm with Fiore & Sons. And for those who know Fiore & Sons, we're currently a third generation business here in Colorado. We move dirt. You may have seen us working on a project just down the road, this big Amazon building that was a behemoth that's now vacant. We did that. How many of you own a business, want to own a business someday? Can I see a show of hands? Okay, of those, how many of you plan to retire at some point? Okay, all of you. All right, that's great. That's the big question that we faced at Fiore. It started off with Grandpa Ed. He was a farmer, a celery farmer. He had somebody come and want to dig gravel out of his yard. So he said, okay, I'll get paid a royalty to have dirt and gravel taken out of my property. All right, and then he saw all these trucks running up and down his driveway, and he said, I'm getting paid for the rock, but if I had a truck, I'd get paid to haul that rock off my own property. So he bought a truck. And that's where Fiore started. Ed Fiore got a truck, and then he got multiple trucks. And then he got his kid into the business. So Larry comes up in the family, and he starts working on equipment. And he says, we can dig holes too. So why don't we dig the hole, sell the rock, truck the rock, and do it for others. So the story started to evolve. It's seeing a problem, fixing the problem. That's the story of Fiore. So now we're third generation. Larry's kids grew up, helping fix equipment at night after school, and maybe skipping school on occasion, I don't know. And doing what brothers do, they egg each other on and they want to be the best. So they're operating equipment. The big cash register building in downtown Denver, that was one of Fiore's first really big projects, is digging a hole to put the foundation for the cash register building. And there's a picture of the oldest Fiore's son, of the current generation of owners, operating an excavator on a dirt pile at downtown Denver. Now, that might have violated some child labor laws, but he assures me he was old enough at 9 to be doing that. So, that's how family businesses start. You find a problem, you want to solve it, you say, I can get paid to do this, this is awesome, and you grow a business. Well, you get into the 4th generation of Fiore's, and they looked around and they said, well, this child is not interested in construction. They never were. They take off and they go into banking. This child, maybe they want to do construction, but boy, they are not a leader. And the business would not survive if we went that route. So what is an owner to do when you have that 4th generation that's not going to be in a place to take over the business? You don't want to see the business disappear. You want to see it continue. That's your legacy, right? You don't build something to just see it crumble. You want to see it thrive and succeed. So what we did at Fiore was we started back in 2022 when, Butch, the second child of the current generation, said, I think I'm going to want to retire. My wife sure wants me to retire. She gets mad with how much time I spend at work. What are we going to do? So it all started with valuing your company, right? That's where you need to start. I need to value this company so I know what do I have my hands on. So they get consultants in. They bring others in, valuation companies, digging through papers and financials, and we spend a lot of time building up the value of the organization. And then you have a starting point. Now, that starting point was probably way up here in their mind when reality is about here. Because we all think what we've done is way better than what anybody tells us. Then once you have a value, it's like, okay, what would we want to do with this business? Do we want to sell it to our employees? Do we want management to buy it out? Do we want to sell to private equity? Do we want a strategic partner to come in, somebody who knows our business and tuck us in? You've seen a lot of that activity lately. Or do we want to look at an alternative method? And that's where we entered into the ESOP conversation. So back in December of 2024, we started in 22. Not until 2024 did we finally wrap a bow and put the transaction together to become an ESOP. So we sold 51% to the ESOP. It's kind of the dipping the toes in the water. I don't want to get rid of all the business. I don't want to get pushed out. I want to have a say. How do I do that? How do I maintain it? And so we get down the road and it's, all right, 49%. We'll do 49% because then we have majority control. And then there's this thing in a transaction called a minority shareholder discount. Well, I don't want to devalue my, payout by 5% just for one little tiny point. So let's go 51. Then the ESOP has the majority and we increase the value, right? Now, here's private equity value, strategic partner sale value, ESOP value. So in order to go ESOP, there's less money coming into the owner's pocket. So how do you justify that? It's all about, let's see, I've already got 3 pages into my notes and I haven't turned a page yet, but private equity, you're going to get money immediately. They're going to come in, write a check, and you can ride off into the sunset. But they are going to be focused on what? Profit. What's my EBITDA? How are we going to cut? Well, this guy that's been in the business for 40 years, you just fired him. Well, yeah, he's not adding value. Oh, yeah, but he's got our story. He knows us. He's part of our culture. Yeah, but it's all about the bottom line. Now, I'm not saying that's bad or wrong. I'm just saying that's a risk. When you sell to somebody else, they call the shots, and they can determine who stays on board, who doesn't. A strategic sale, yeah, you get some money right up front, but maybe the company that bought you has an accounting department, and your company has an accounting department. Well, what's going to happen there? Efficiency, right? They're going to bring all of your books into theirs, and they don't need that team anymore. Okay, that's a risk. Marketing, you name it. Maybe redundant construction capacities. Well, we don't need 18 utility crews here in this geographic area. We're going to let 8 of them go, right? You can't control that. And again, there's a lot of value being driven for that strategic sale. Now, on the flip side, an ESOP, the value's lower, and when do you get your cash? Over time. You're going to be around the business. You're going to help run and maintain the business until the next generation, which our 4th generation at Fiore is now the employees, and that's how we sell it. You are the 4th generation. You are the ones going to carry this company into the future. You maintain the culture. You keep everything going the way it was, and that's, the beauty of an ESOP sale. Now, enter banking relationships, right? Because you have to take on some debt to give a little bit of payout to those owners. The ESOP takes that on. The ESOP then maybe carries additional debt to pay those owners over time. Your balance sheet changes, life changes. You now provide a lot more financial information to those employees that before they kind of knew if the company was doing good or bad, but they didn't see. What's your interest expense? How much in depreciation? What's your fixed asset load? What are your ratios? Let me look at your current ratio. How much cash do we have? We made how much money and I didn't get a bonus? There are all these questions that come up because in an ESOP, you become a lot more transparent. And that's a hard culture shift for some people. I like to keep it close to the fist. And you go to ESOP, and as an owner, how many of you as owners, maybe, your wife or your significant other has a credit card that they fill up their gas tank with, and it's attached to the company? No? Ours was the only one? Okay. Those disappear. Those perks disappear. Spouse travel, it disappears because we need to protect the value for our employee owners. Everything we do is now an employee owner mindset. And that's why we chose to go with an ESOP. How many of you have heard of or considered or seen anything about ESOPs before? Great, most of you. About 20 years ago, it was an interesting niche tax strategy. You looked at it and it was like, so wait a minute, now that we went 51% ESOP, 51% of our net income is not taxable. Oh, okay. What does that do for a company? Maintains cash, increases free cash flow. Then you have cash to pay down the debt. Once the debt is paid, you have cash to expand your business, to grow, to buy more capital, buy other companies. We've seen that a lot where ESOPs buy companies to continue to improve and increase value for employee owners. We had a couple of competitors just recently that went that route with another ESOP. That ESOP came in and said, hey, you can be an employee owner. We're going to buy your company, and all your employees get tucked in, and they're now owners of this big organization. Okay, sounds pretty attractive because each and every one of you then have a retirement account kind of built in through that employee ownership. So, I could go on and on, but it was really about maintaining our culture and ensuring that that didn't disappear. That as soon as the transaction happened, things didn't change for the employees. And it gave time under an employee mindset for the current generation of Fioris to see who doesn't have the Fiori name but can carry on this business and run it well. And let me see them really run with an ownership mindset. Because before that, succession, people, yeah, they were doing their job, but were they really thinking about the company and running the organization? Maybe, maybe not. I like to think I was, but that's just me. So what didn't change? You know, people began thinking like owners instead of just being employees. But your brand, your customers, your leadership team, none of that changes in an ESOP transaction. So the reality is that about 80 to 90% of construction companies are family owned. Over 10,000 construction businesses change ownership annually. That's a lot. And the majority do sell externally. You know, they don't see that next generation, and, you know, people want to retire well. You built something fantastic. You might as well benefit from it, right? Now, 45 to 55% are strategic buyer, 25 to 35% go private equity, only 2 to 6% go ESOP. So it is the path less traveled, but it is very attractive in the construction space. You know, about 17%, I think, of all ESOPs are construction companies. So it's a very attractive result for construction because I do believe in the construction space, the family speaks loudly, and the culture you create, people in the construction space don't want it to disappear. You know, professional services, yeah, who cares? We'll sell, we'll, you know, ebb and flow. But in construction, we're family, right? So that's the beauty there. So the question that you need to answer when you're thinking about what you want to do with your business, as you think about retirement, who will own the company? Who do you want to own the company? What do you want it to look like? And that will guide your path, right? Because we had people knock on the door saying, we'll buy your company and we'll give you X. Well, the owners were willing to accept Y because the Y mattered, and that's employees. So there you go. That's the story of Fiori. So finally, December of 2024, we closed the transaction. We're now a 51% ESOP, and you know, we couldn't have done it without a lot of help. There's a lot of paperwork, a lot of grind, but in the end, it's worth it. So if you have questions afterwards, you know, feel free to come up and we can talk specifics about how the banks will twist you and hurt you, and bonding companies will hurt you, and what's my exit strategy? Oh, man, my exit strategy is to keep going to work and increase value, right? Because as I do that, that increases the money that's in my retirement account that cost $0 out of my pocket. The company funds it, right? So, yeah, that's my exit strategy. You know, wait till I'm 100% vested, and then I'm out. No, I'm just kidding. All right, so back to you.
Yeah. Thanks. No, and there's a lot of stories like that. I appreciate Brady coming up here and explaining what they went through. It has benefited them, and it's kept culture in place, and it's empowered their people. So again, that's one strategy to it. So thank you again for doing that. I'll bring up our three panelists. We'll kind of do a round robin of questions. I'll try and feed off of what that conversation looks like. And then we'll have a Q&A kind of at the end. And Brady, I'll probably bring you back up too in case people have additional questions. I might just float around the room a little bit, listen so that I'm not handing this off back and forth. But I'll bring up each of our three panelists. So as we get this going, first I'll bring up Sandy Shoemaker. So Sandy is ESOP expert also, but she's with the Colorado Office of Economic Development and International Trade. Sandy has passion working with companies in transition who are seeking to maintain their legacy and engage their workforce through employee ownership. She has worked for over 20 years advising companies about employee ownership, assisting them after the transaction, and after spending over 30 years in public accounting, she now serves on the ESOP company boards, educates companies on ESOP alternatives, and will lead a transition to employee ownership. And she's on the finance committee of the ESOP Association, is a member of the NCEO, and speaks at ESOP conferences across the nation. So thank you, Sandy. Yeah. I'll bring up Eric Coet. But Eric is the founder of 44 North and serves as strategic practice leader of Peak Solutions, which is a consulting firm specializing in organizational health. He definitely has his roots in Hensel Phelps Construction, original co-founder of Old Elk Distilleries, a unique background as a leader in operations marketing and work procurement and project development project development. So thanks for being here, Eric. And then I'll bring up David Bashford, who's a partner at Mitchell, Barlow, and Mansfield. He's our resident attorney today. His practice includes business and management side employment matters. During his years as an in-house corporate general counsel, he developed a practical approach that centers on direct information and advice with a focus on timely insights, creativity, judgment, born of experience, and the value of durable relationships. So he helped me and my company through a transaction that we went through, so he's been incredibly invaluable. And so we're happy to have all three of you up here today. The first question that I'll lead with you, Eric, is going to be why. It's why should succession planning be a priority for now, whether you're small or mid-level, and what does that look like?
Good morning. Well, no matter where you find yourself in the life cycle of your business, succession planning should be a top priority. And when we think about succession planning, there's two different things that you really think about. We've talked a lot about how you're going to transition the company ownership, and we're going to talk about that. That's a big part of that. But what I focus on a lot, and I do a lot of strategic planning with companies, and part and parcel to that is organizational strategy. Much more than an org structure, but it really deals with how are we going to develop the future leaders of our organization. Because when you're thinking about succession planning and transition, whether you're thinking about outright selling to private equity or an ESOP, or you're a small business that you're going to sell it to your brother, whatever the answer is, it's the same answer with your people, or it should be the same answer with your people. Because when you're building your people, and you're building future leaders, and you're building leaders that know how to develop other leaders, you're building value in your business. And I think the example we looked at this morning with Fiore is a good example of that. And if you think about it, other than real estate, your people are the only things that appreciate in your company. They should be the only things that appreciate. They get more expensive, but they should also bring more value and results as they grow in the organization. So when I look at people development, again, I came from a Hensel Phelps background. I also work with small businesses. I've got a small business actually in Vail that does $5 million a year, and they're in the middle of a 7-year buyout, and that is a transition to a brother. But we're developing that brother from and it's electrical subcontractor, but from a lead foreman to a project manager to director of construction to becoming the owner, and it's a buyout over time. But you really can't skip steps in your development. And I think as an industry, we perpetuate our own problems of that, right? People chasing titles, and compensation, rather than building their career and building, and not skipping steps in their development. to become the best project manager, the best superintendent, the best estimator, or whatever you're talking about. And so when you think about organizational strategy, I want you to think about, number one, the end game. What is you asked the right question. What is my exit strategy? We have to answer that, especially if you're an equity owner in a company. You need to know where you're headed as an organization and whether you want to be a legacy organization that's handed down to your employees, or whether you're going to sell, or whatever, or anything in between. And all those answers are okay. But we need to understand where you're headed as an organization, and then also figure out how are we going to develop our people resources to effectively return margin to the organization so that we're a financially secure organization, and we have a healthy balance sheet. How are we going to structure our financials so that we are not devaluing our company by how we handle our financials? And we can talk about that more later. And then also, how are we developing our people to get to the next level? When we're developing project managers and superintendents and estimators, et cetera, we're developing a pool of potential future leaders, vice presidents, owners, potentials, right? And so we need to make sure that they've come up through the steps and understand the business as best as they can. And so that's a big focus for me. And you can't start soon enough. Last point on that. When you look at like a Hensel Phelps, you say, okay, well, they've been around since 1937. Well, they became employee-owned in 1989. And that whole structure there was built on the fact that they wanted to be a legacy organization that remained privately held. And the only way to do that is to develop your own talent in-house and develop wealth within those individuals so they can buy out the next individuals, right? So, and again, I would submit to you that model works regardless of your end game, whether you're going to sell or remain a legacy organization.
Cool. David, I'll go to you too. As far as we talked about why start sooner, but what's the risks of waiting too long?
Well, maybe just to pick up right up where you left off. Oh, I do want to pause though. Brady, he said in construction it's all about family. And did you notice he said with professional service organizations, who cares? Was his comment. I'm sitting there thinking, we pretend we're professional. It is a service. I was a little wounded by that. But then I thought, lawyers are mercenaries. You know, when we get ready to transition, we don't care what happens. Okay, in my view, looking at this where we get involved in the transaction, we think you want to start early to build what Jamie Dimon once described as a fortress balance sheet. And here's what my experience has been. You will hopefully have options. We could sell to a strategic buyer. We could form an ESOP. We could sell to private equity. We could have a management buyout. One of the things that for us is always painful to see with a client is when they get to the point finally where they want to do something, and because of the way they've built the business, manage the business, there are options that are eliminated. You will not be appealing to a strategic buyer because it's not really practical right now to do anything from an ESOP standpoint because. And we encourage our clients, and I would encourage you as you start to think about this, whether you're currently an owner or you're someone who thinks one day I'd like to be an owner, I'd like to kind of know what's going to happen from a transition standpoint in this organization, to build an organization that maintains all of those options, keeps them all in front of you, so that as markets move, as the way that businesses are valued shifts, as the ownership generation gets older, you've preserved the ability to choose the option at the time that makes the most sense to you. The other reason you've got to start early is because some of these options take time. And if we have a chance today, I'm happy to talk about some of the things that build friction into this process. But let me just give you a quick example. You may think as an organization, we would like to sell ultimately to a strategic buyer. We like that idea because it carries some of the same benefits as an ESOP. They know the industry, maybe they even know us. They have an interest in continuing to operate independently. And so we'd love to find a strategic buyer. Well, strategic buyers tend to come to the table with one of three purposes if they're interested in you. And depending on their purpose, it'll change the way they value your business, meaning the way they evaluate the company. Some strategic buyers are interested because it gives them a chance to eliminate a competitor. They're like, this is great. We can take you out of the market. And that's helpful to us. And so they will look at the valuation of the business very differently than a strategic buyer who says, what we're interested in is capacity. We're not so interested in what your work pipeline is. We're more interested in gaining capacity because we've got enough for more than we can do. So this is a quick, if you will, or easier way for us to gain capacity. So they're going to be less concerned about some elements of your financial statements, for example, or your backlog, your workflow, for example. The third kind of strategic buyer that we often see are strategic buyers who say, no, we're precisely interested in growing market share. And we think this acquisition will do that more effectively for us than if we try to grow it ourselves. Once again, that will change the way that the valuation and ultimately the transaction is built. Just back to my point of, you want to start thinking about it early so that you keep these options in front of you, so that if you say we want to go strategic, you're going to look appealing to all flavors of strategic buyer, for example. And ultimately, you may decide we want a strategic buyer who's interested in capacity or market share as opposed to eliminating a competitor, because my point is just, but you want to have the choice. Right? You don't want it imposed upon you because you've really only built a company to be appealing to one kind of buyer in a certain kind of circumstance with a particular valuation.
Yeah, fair. Sandy, even going to you, any additional to that, or even from an owner's perspective, how do they get to ESOP or not ESOP or any of the other options, hopefully that they do have by the time that they're ready to sell or when they start thinking about what that exit strategy looks like?
Well, and I appreciate that, David. Looking at your comments about talking about it early. The best conversation I had was a guy that came to me and he's like, I'm not going to do anything tomorrow. I'm like 10 years out. I'm like, perfect. Let's have this conversation because it takes some of the emotional side of it out where you can have a conversation, because I go back to the goals. The very first thing I need to understand, and although I spend my time in the ESOP world, having come from EKS&H and that accounting world, it's an independent thought process that I want to help you get through. And whatever that answer is, we want it to be the right answer for you. That's the conversation we had at Fiore. What's the right answer for you guys? And then let's get the right people to help you. But taking your time to go through that why. What's your goal as an owner? Do you want to go sit on the beach? Do you want to buy the big boat? Do you want to be at the office every day until God says you can't be there anymore? You know, we always say you're going to transition, whether you plan it or somebody else plans it. You're going to transition, and hopefully you can plan it in the process. So starting out with the owner's goals, and I like the other comment that got made is you have to include the spouses in that process. Because there's got to be some honest conversations, or if there's family, if there's brothers, one brother wants to get out, the other brothers want the brother out. You know, there's lots of dynamics going on there. Do you want to be able to have Christmas dinner together still? Because I've had that happen where they don't have Christmas dinner together anymore, and but so you understanding those ramifications and having those conversations. But I think I loved your question to Brady. What's his exit strategy? Because building your exit strategy, building what your succession plan is down through the whole organization, it's not just about the CEO. It's not just about the CFO. It's about your supers. It's about your operators. We got to train the next guy, because if you're not there to do it, or you want to do something else, you can't do it until you train someone else to do your job. Because then as you go through the process, if you have the goals, and I write them down on the top of every sheet of paper that we put in front of everybody as we're talking, whether it's the ownership group, because we can come back to it, because when it does get hard, and it does get hard, Brady, doesn't it? You can come back to why are we doing this? And I think that just keeps clarity in the process as you go through it.
I think, too, when we talk about is the owner ready, is it not, I'd be interested on your comments on how you get an owner prepared for what does it look like, what am I ready, and then to give up the reins. And I guess it probably lends a little bit into the development of leaders and what are the options that you need to be thinking about as an owner, and what exit looks like into the people that are underneath you. And that can be maybe that decision that is, I don't have the people that can carry it on, or I do. How do you get there from an options standpoint? Like, what are the strategies around developing leaders?
I'll start them, and this is Eric's place, absolutely. But, having a third generation family-owned business, it's like 2% of all businesses that are family-owned can never get to that point. It just doesn't happen. And in today's world, looking at owners' children, are they interested in the business? It used to be, yes, Dad, and being a woman up here, I can say that, yes, Dad, I want to be in the business. Or, I know I don't have a choice. That's what's going to happen, is I'm going to be in the business. Well, the kids today are much more open to saying what they really want to go do. And so we don't have that generation sitting there ready, coming up through the business, ready to go. It does happen, don't get me wrong, but I think we see more opportunities where the kids are saying, no, I don't want it. And so we've got to have those other options available to the organization, because that family feeling doesn't go away. That I want to pass this on to somebody that helped me grow it doesn't go away. And that's really when, especially in the employee ownership space, what I'm listening for when I'm talking about why are we having this conversation about employee ownership. And it's legacy. It's I want to help. I want to give back to those that helped me build it. But addressing the organizational development piece is absolutely key, along with structuring a transaction. We can get into structuring the transaction, but eventually, again, those owners are going to move on, or they have to pass the reins, because if you don't, you're not going to keep the leaders around. So I would love to hear Eric's comments on that.
Well, I would say founder owners are the best and the worst thing that ever happened to the company. And I say that because I worked with a lot of them, and it's their baby, right? And it's hard to let go of those reins. And if you think about it, every one of us have developed in a career. When you were young in the seat and you were really good at what you did, it's hard to step up and delegate to others that make that transition and trust them. Right? It's hard for each of you to trust certain individuals today. The professionally managed business looks at the business as the product. So if you look at the business as the product, that is in and of itself, how do we build a business system that works, that creates results, creates opportunity for our people, builds people, et cetera. And in the founder owner situation, and if you find yourself in that situation, that's who you are, you really have to do a lot of work on yourself to really define where you want to go as an individual, where you want to go as a family, and what's most important to you for your people and the legacy you're going to leave there. And those are hard answers. There's not a one size fits all, and oftentimes that takes time and maybe even working with an executive coach or somebody like that. And by the way, as a consultant, you can't possibly hire enough outside consultants to come in and train your people. You have to do that yourself. You have to get really good at developing people on the job training and individually. But there are some instances where you may need some outside help to be that mirror to see what you're not seeing, because the future's coming whether you plan for it or not. And at some point, succession is going to happen whether you plan for it or not. And so wouldn't it be better to be more strategic about that and think about it and understand what your goals are, and then start developing your organization in that direction? Because, again, whether you're going to sell or hand it down to the people below you, it's a very similar answer in developing your organization so that you have options, as he pointed out, down the road.
Yeah, my comment maybe is a little off the mark, but I think the other thing that is important to think about for owners, founder owners or otherwise, even senior executives in an organization, is then what after the transaction? That will also determine what you may want to do. And I'll just give you some quick examples, maybe a couple anecdotes, just a minute or two. If the owner or ownership group is thinking, after closing, we want to be gone, right, we are done here, then that pretty much eliminates private equity. That pretty much eliminates management buyout. And it focuses you more particularly on a strategic buyer. who will typically come to the table with their own senior leadership group, right? So they look at the owner and they're like, we really don't have a place for you. We do for some of your senior people, certainly, but not so much for you. So if you would leave after we close, that would be ideal. If an owner is thinking, I don't want to leave right away, then we're eliminating, for example, probably that strategic buyer in favor of a different approach. The other then what that often doesn't get thought about is the extent to which I do or don't care as a seller about what happens to the company after the transaction. And we see this frequently in private equity transactions, where they will require, as part of the transaction, that some of the proceeds are rolled over into equity in the private equity company, specifically because they want sellers to have a vested interest in the next turn that private equity company has, usually 4 to 7 years out. And so they want to anchor the sellers into the business for a period of time, and they do that through carry forward ownership. The other reason they do that is because they will be free cash flow or EBITDA focused, so they are going to ask you as a selling owner who now has ownership in the parent to announce the very hard decisions that are going to be made in that company to free up as much cash flow as they possibly can for the next turn. So if an owner thinks, I don't want to do that, or I couldn't do that, or I couldn't stand to see that happen, that may eliminate that option. My point is simply, you want to be very thoughtful, and I think it takes time, about what do I want to have happen after. And as you're developing leaders, to be sensitive to what those leaders want to have happen after. Otherwise, things can get a little difficult. We've got a client right now who sold to private equity, cannot stand what is happening to the business, so we're currently negotiating to buy it back, which is a real treat.
And that's cheap though too, isn't it?
Yeah, because think what the private equity company now thinks the value is versus what the owner thinks they've done to the value. And it's just a morality tale for me about not fully formed on what I want to have happen next and understanding what the ramifications are of the type of ownership change I implement to what happens next.
So depending on what those choices look like and depending on what you want to set yourself up for, from a strategy development, what processes, systems do you need to be putting in place and thinking about, even from what your books look like? Would you tell me more about like how you view that from what you could be doing now, from a, what the value in and having systems and processes and documentation?
So I'll touch on one area there, because that's like a gigantic question. That, you know, I mean, you talk about, let's get the lawyers, the accountants, Sandy's former life, right, in the room, all going, okay, here's what has to happen. But let me just point out a couple of things. You want to be thoughtful about processes you put in place in the company that may or may not create friction in the later ownership change. And let me give you a couple of examples. In closely held businesses, we often see if shares, if you're in LLC units, but if shares are going to change hands, that there are rights of first refusal or rights of first offer. And if you have a right of first refusal and you've got a private equity or strategic buyer who's interested in the business and you're interested in them, they may lose interest if they know that they'll go through diligence, put an offer on the table, and then someone else gets a chance to match it, to benefit from their work. So you will narrow the field of potential acquirers if you have rights of first offer. There's a remedy to that. We limit the scope of where that right of first offer applies. I'll give you another example. A lot of businesses say, I want to share the proceeds of what happens when we sell with key people because they helped to get me here, back to this sense of family that Brady talked about. And so you'll put in place what's often called a transaction bonus agreement that says to certain key people, when we sell the business, an amount or a percent of the proceeds go to you. It's a really simplified version of an ESOP, kind of like we won't go to all the ESOP trouble because we're just going to sell, we're not sharing ownership, but we are going to share the proceeds with some of our key people. Well, those proceeds for some of your businesses could be life-changing. So a buyer is like, what motivation would that person have to stay and keep working with us post-close because you just made them a millionaire? And so that will have to be addressed. So I guess my short answer is, you want to be thoughtful about very well-intentioned things that you do that are not bad, but you want to understand what are the ramifications of this once we get to a point of thinking through a transition or a transaction.
Let me address something with the ESOP. On the ESOP side of that equation, I'll talk to companies and they say, well, we want everybody to think like owners, so we're going to sell to an ESOP. Those are two different things. You can sell to an ESOP, but you still have to be a well-run company. An ESOP doesn't fix the problems. You have to, you can have, I'm sitting here in Fort Collins and I'm going to say this, New Belgium Brewing, who was an ESOP company, was a fantastic employee-owned business. But they didn't become employee-owned in their mindset because they became an ESOP. They were already there. They practiced. You can practice all the ownership mindset, thinking, and training without being an ESOP. So understanding the process of what you have to do, if you want to have an employee ownership mindset and you want to use an employee ownership tool, whether it's a co-op, an ESOP, an alternative equity structure. We have all kinds of different things that the state supports, right, Libby? Libby's with the Office of Economic Development as well here. That we can use those as tools, but you still have to do the work. Just like everything that goes along with your culture is what you make of it, and ESOP doesn't make your culture.
Nope, fair. The other thing that I was going to go into is how can you use like your org chart as far as planning, and what does that look like, and kind of aligning succession planning with the long-term business strategy? Like, do those things go hand in hand, and how can your org chart play into that?
Yeah, they do go hand in hand, and that's why, when I facilitate strategic planning, we get clear on vision, we get clear on all those things initially, but then we dive into what is our organizational structure looking out, not the company we are today, but the company that we're going to be. What does that look like? And how are we going to grow into that? And then we start to come back and we say, okay, here we are today. In 1 year, what are we going to look at? What are the key positions that we need to develop? And then the reality is still, most companies are still in the reality that they have to hire from the outside, right, for certain positions. But really, really helping them get the engine started of developing from the bottom up and developing your own talent. I believe if you're going to be a sustainable construction company, looking at the labor issues, et cetera, on the craft side as well as on the staff side, that you're going to need to be a really good developer of people and future leaders. And so, that succession, so your organizational chart shows that career pathing, but it also shows the steps. Like if I was stepping back, and these are the conversations we have, if I was going to design the perfect project manager, what steps would I bring them through in order to develop that perfect project manager? Well, I would they'd start off in the field as a field engineer, and they would then go into the office, and they'd understand the office side of things, start checking submittals and understand RFIs and change estimates, et cetera. They'd become a project engineer where they're overseeing a lot of that. And then they'd go back out in the field and they'd run work again, because we're building builders. And through that process, they are managing people. They're doing reviews. They're doing goal setting. They're learning how to manage themselves in their own time. They're doing some training, so they're learning how to train. And so they're learning systems and processes all the way up through this, so that by the time they become a project manager, they're a seasoned individual. And so now, if we get that engine started, and you go back to the Hensel Phelps example that I mentioned, so since '89, and back then they were hiring project managers, et cetera, but when I was still there in 2014, the conversations we were having when we talked about our growth plan for the next year, our profit plan for the next year, if we were going to grow by $250 million, we'd ask how many interns and how many field engineers do we need to hire? We weren't asking how many project managers and how many superintendents we were going to hire, because we were going to promote those, right, in that growth. So we had that engine started, that pull through from the bottom up. And I'm just saying, no matter if your business is 5 million a year or 500 million a year, you can get that engine started, right? And so there's that not only the career development, but also what that looks like from the standpoint of compensation, profit sharing, whatever that looks like. And that fits into the piece of where are we headed long term. If it is that we want to remain in a legacy organization, how are we going to position these people to be able to take over? If it's for a sale, how are we going to position these people to become leaders that bring value to our sale, and also have a great opportunity to stay with the company afterwards, that bonding sureties are comfortable with, that the leaders of the new, whoever's the strategic buyer is comfortable with, all those things, right? And so when we're building people, we're building value in them, and we're building value in us.
I think there's a tag-along corollary to that. As you're developing great people, it's not unusual for them to say, I'd like a piece of equity. You know, I'm investing in you as a company. I think I'm making good headway. We're implementing the resources and strategies that have been put together for us, and so I'd like some equity. And it's not unusual at all for companies to say, yeah, let's develop a way to share some equity with you. Short, again, of an ESOP, or sometimes it's a precursor to, I think it's fair to say. And so we seed little bits of equity, either in the form of performance shares, meaning nobody's buying anything, it's in exchange for the service you're providing to the company, or we set up a way for people to purchase an interest in the business. And so you can end up with a cap table that has lots of smaller owners in it, and it's a way that you're anchoring them to the business, which is helpful from this future-proofing the company standpoint, and also a great way to keep people around. And then it comes time to transact, and if you're not mindful of your ability as a majority in the business to either call those shares back or compel those minority shareholders to participate in the transaction, once again, things can get all bogged down. You know, everybody says we're selling, and you've got a couple of minority shareholders who say, I'm not, I think the value could be higher, and so everything comes to a full stop. So it's helpful then, if you can go to the shareholder agreement or the operating agreement and say, actually, we've got drag along rights here, so we're gonna drag you along. You will participate. Kicking and screaming, you get to participate. And you'll have in those governing documents what's called a call right, which says at any time the company can call your shares back, meaning we can buy you back out at any time that we want to. And this gets back to, there are always two levels in my mind that you're working on. Future-proofing the business from a people standpoint, probably the most important, powerful thing you can do. And underneath that, taking care from a governing standpoint of making sure that that very future-proofing does not work against you when it comes time to do some kind of transaction.
So when it comes to like the legal documents, what are the legal documents that are in place that you need to be aware of, and what are the biggest risks as far as legal mistakes when it comes to any buy-sell agreements and as you're working through that?
Again, it's a huge question, and we get paid a lot of money to answer that question. So call me. No. But I'll give you a short answer, because there are some critical things, and I've already alluded to it. We see this a lot with legacy and family-owned companies, which is all I mention it. You're set up, you're entrepreneurial. By the way, law firms do the same thing, right? We're all just entrepreneurs running businesses. We're just in a different industry. And you may or may not have ever adopted bylaws or a shareholder, some people call them buy-sell agreement, or if you're an LLC, an operating agreement, or you did way back when, back to Fiore and Sons, when generation one, when grandpa set it up, nobody's ever looked at them since. Now we're gonna try to do all this stuff, and we find out that we're limited by our governing documents, so everything has to be amended, and you end up with sort of this scramble to get the corporate side of the business organized so that you can take care of the transactional side of the business now that you want to. So I would say part of this planning that we're talking about, in addition to people, and again, I would emphasize, I think that's the most important, would be if you haven't in a while, especially if no one can easily put their thumb on them, go back to those governing documents and say, do these need to be refreshed? Dollars to donuts, if you're a closely held company, probably.
Well, and from a corporate structure perspective, so I just started working with a company that tried to go through an employee ownership transaction 3 years ago. And I don't know what the org chart looked like, and I'm talking about the entity org chart, but evidently it was a mess. And now that we're revisiting it, they didn't do it 3 years ago, but now they've kind of moved through, they did a buyout of, so there's lots of different, everybody has their own story. That's why we wanted, I mean, Brady, you did a great job telling the Fiore story. So there's pieces in there that you guys could relate to, but then there's always pieces that are unique to you. So yeah, let's go through and talk about building the flexibility. So what does the org structure look like? It might have made sense when they put that entity in place that over here holds the equipment, and this one over here does business in Arizona, and this one up here has all the employees, and this one down here was, oh, we tried that, but that didn't work, and the company still exists. So going through and talking about where we might want to go, but it's kind of like building your computer system, right? I call it a honeycomb. You just keep adding on, and it works until at some point you just have to kind of refresh it, or maybe tearing up the pavement, right? You can only put so many layers of pavement on before you have to tear it all off and start over again. So going through that process, and it does take time, and sometimes it's like, really, do we have to pay for all of this stuff? Yes, you do. I don't know what that was. It was probably an earring, but don't worry about it. But revisiting that is a good corporate governance practice, and doing it in preparation for knowing you're one day going to have to go through an exit. Do it again when there's not so much emotion tied to it, because you asked the emotional question earlier, and there's so much emotion tied to this. And there's the stuff you have to do, but then we have to deal with the emotional side of it, and those two can come very intertwixt. So we just formed a holding company. Well, what's the new name of the holding company, and who gets to name it? And that was one of the gifts we gave to the outgoing CEO, was he got to kind of put the name out there for the whole new holding company that we were forming. So there's a lot of fun stuff that goes along with this too, I guess is my point.
So maybe this is you, David, since I'm asking a bunch of loaded questions. Non-competes. So you get to the point and you have this. What does that mean for an owner leaving? What does it mean for key executives? What does it mean for employees generally? Like, what are the things that we think about from non-competes?
Non-competes.
I told you it was a loaded question.
Let's all do business in Wyoming, where this is like, whatever you want is fine. Yeah, we will be reconvening up north in 2 hours. Okay, this conversation will be very different. Colorado, as a matter of public policy, says non-competes are void. Cannot have them except in certain specific circumstances. And one of the circumstances where you can have them is in relation to a transaction. So let me first answer the transaction question, and then we'll just come back to employees every day, because that's the second one I guess we need to answer. From a transactional standpoint, any seller should fully expect that they will enter into a non-compete restrictive covenant with the buyer. Perfectly enforceable in Colorado and everywhere else. And the term of that non-competition will typically run somewhere between, for a seller, 7 and 10 years. I mention that because this is another area sometimes where we're not very thoughtful. We think, I'm going to sell. I'm going to ride off into the sunset. I'm buying the boat. It's going to be great. And a year later, you're bored on the boat, or your spouse is saying, you have got to go do something. Anything at all. I just don't want to see you for a while. And so the seller says, I think I'm going to start, like, not the same business, but kind of, get back in. I can do a little thing. And the answer is no, you may not. Not for 9 more years. And that can be a hard thing to hear. If you sell to a private equity company and they employ you, you will also have a non-competition associated with your employment agreement. If you also roll over proceeds into ownership in the private equity company, you will have a third non-competition covenant related to your ownership in the private equity company as an owner. As a seller, as an employee, and as an owner, all of those would be enforceable, and they will all have different terms. We call them the non-compete stack. So the first thing you want to do as part of any transaction, not the first, but one of the things that you always have to work through is, what does that non-compete stack look like? Is it too limiting? Is it about right? Am I comfortable with it or not? Back to this, after closing, then what? In terms of existing employees in Colorado, you can have an employee under a non-compete covenant as long as two conditions are met. One, they have to earn above a certain amount every year, or an annualized compensation from your business. That number indexes up every year. I forget right now what the number is for 2026. Does anybody know? It's 100 and something thousand a year. In addition to that, you must be able to demonstrate that the purpose of the non-compete is to protect your trade secrets. And I do not mean trade as in my trade. I mean as in our business has trade secrets. Things that are unique to us, that give us a competitive advantage in the marketplace, that we aggressively take steps to protect. Your client list, not a trade secret. The way that you schedule jobs, not a trade secret. What we find is that most businesses do not have trade secrets. We all think we have trade secrets, but most of us do not. And if you cannot demonstrate that you have trade secrets, and the only way to protect them is with this non-competition covenant versus something like a confidentiality agreement, then that non-compete will be void. So it's difficult to get employees, just routine employees, under non-competition agreement. So we say it's possible, but man, you got to do the math and make sure it would even be enforceable.
So this kind of leads to down the road we've sold, or now we've figured out maybe before we sold, as an owner, this is what I'm thinking about. At what point in the communication with employees, that could mean key level, could mean company-wide, what's the best strategy around what that communication to the company may look like?
You mean at the time of the transaction?
Or, yeah, or that it could be earlier saying this is what our strategy is and we'd like to bring in. I mean, I think, yeah.
When do you communicate your exit strategy?
Yeah. There are probably as many opinions about that as there are instances of it, I would say. From a planning standpoint, and I'll defer to you on this because I'm going to give you sort of a cheeky answer. But I think if you're being thoughtful about this, and your thought is we want the company to succeed into the hands of individuals who are here, or individuals that we're developing, then my suspicion is that should be part of the conversation all along, so that they know what they're investing in as they continue to work with and be a part of the organization, that you would want them to know or to understand. The other two answers to the question are often when and how employees are informed is part of the transaction process. The buyer will dictate that. Here's when who can be told. We have a transaction we finished. Our client was the buyer, closed about a month ago. It's yet to be made public. Our go public date is coming up a little later this month. And so I would say it can be driven by the transaction itself. When and how you share that news often is determined as part of the negotiation of the transaction.
I mean, I would just add that, I mean, the human side of me says, that you should communicate it, and not surprise your people. But the reality is that loose lips sink ships, and that's undefeated. And so it really depends on the situation. Like you just said, the buyer will dictate. If you're a shareholder, you better be in on it, though. I mean, that understanding that, and also the situation of, are you actively seeking buyers confidentially and trying to make a choice of what the direction you want to head? That's not information for your that you want out there or you need out there. And so that's definitely a personal decision that you guys will have to work through in the process, depending on your situation.
Yeah, I like what David said about this, especially in the employee ownership situation. So in most cases, if you sell to your employees, there is some type of a big announcement that happens. Usually post-transaction is best. Some of you may know that there was a announcement about 2 years ago now. I was involved with it. He stood up in front of his whole town and said he was selling his company to his employees, and that didn't happen. So kind of a tough situation. But telling your employees, and especially in the ESOP space, we can do it in some really fun ways, I can tell you. I mean, you guys can ask Brady about his story. Surprising the employees, engaging them in the process. You can say, I just sold the business to you. And you didn't have to pay a dime for it. So there's a lot of creative ways, especially on the employee ownership side, to do that. But it comes with transparency. Because I think that's really when you get to that point and you're going to create employee owners, having transparency, understanding what that means versus just telling them they bought something and now what the hell do they do with it? Not understanding what that really means. But I consult with my clients that let's wait till the transaction closes, and then usually it's a month or two when we put the plan together. But use a communications consultant to do that, especially if you're going to go out to all your employees and help them understand what employee ownership means.
One more thought on that. In the example that I used earlier, and I don't know if you remember it, but the small business up in Vail that's selling to his brother, that communication didn't happen internally until the buy-sell agreement was executed. And also we had a plan for each person in their business. Like what in individual conversations, what does this mean for you? What does this mean for the business? How long am I going to stay around and still be involved? All those things, and I would say that happened last January, and this year we've got more key individuals in the strategic planning room going around the room and talking about how do we make this a smooth transition. You're going to have to step up into a project manager role. You're going to have to step up into an estimator role, and so they're seeing opportunity and they're seeing it. They're riding shotgun on the process to make this a smooth transition.
Yeah, maybe just a footnote. I would also encourage when you get to that point, and this goes a little bit to your plan, the communication, to be candid. I cannot tell you how many times someone has said, nothing's going to change, when everything is going to change. And man, I always just feel bad, because everybody's sitting there going, okay, nothing's going to change. And then within a year, they don't even recognize the place. So I think it's important as part of that planning, whatever the process is, or whatever the transition is that ultimately happens, that you're candid with people about what the implications are. I love this idea of person to person. Yeah. That's fantastic. But so that everyone has the same opportunity to decide if this is good for them or not. Even though they may not find out until after the fact, they still have a decision to make. That's right. Am I staying or am I going?
Yeah, and maybe this is for you, Eric, as kind of an employee or an owner that's hanging on too long, and what that can do from options to a culture. Like when do you need to have that conversation with yourself if you're owning a business about what that transition looks like? I mean, what are the pitfalls to that?
Well, every day you need to ask yourself that question until you know the answer. But I would say, having seen this a few times, and I'm sure all of you have as well, you see the founder. The less, I would say this, first of all, the less your company depends on you as the founder or owner, the more valuable you are, right? And so realizing that, and coming to terms with that, and developing a transition strategy for how that's going to happen, I think is important. But you've seen it can cash strap the business, make it very difficult. There's, you can see cultural problems, with a lot of, conversations behind the scenes about what's going on, and he's not even around. He makes all this money. He's going to Fiji every 2 months. And I mean, there's just a lot of cultural issues that can happen there, that I think can be unhealthy in the business. And so I think a well-founded structure, so if there's a transition happening, a well thought out transition plan. First year, this is what it's going to look like. Second year, this is what it's going to look like. Third year, this is going to look like, and then communicated throughout the organization, and then transition out. But yeah, there's a lot of issues that can come with that. It can also be a healthy thing, depending on the founder owner. So
I think that's why this conversation's so hard, right? Because you're talking to an owner about their retirement and their mortality. Because some of them think they're immortal, right? And having that discussion, and I think if you're a really good leader, you understand that you created value because I have all of you guys that are operating at your top notch. That it's not about me. But that is a really hard discussion, I think, to have with founders, for them to start to make that transition, that this is what I need to be proud of, not this.
No, thank you. And I think I'll give some time for questions because I think people might have those, and if not, I'll still have more. But as far as one thing, what should we be thinking about, whether an employee and owner, but what's one step we can be taking towards that consideration? Whether, I guess it depends on who you are in that, but if you're an owner looking to sell, what's the best thing you can do as a first step if you haven't been thinking about it?
I would say if you haven't done anything, start with educating yourself about what the options are. Make a matrix of here's my options and here's what I want, or here's what each of them brings, and where do I fit into that. I think that is step one of figuring out what it is that you think you might want, and then whether you talk to a consultant or talk to your buddy that, especially in the construction space, that, you all have buddies that have done this. Talk to the guy that just did it. Talk to the guys at Fiore. Talk to the guys, up here, Bryan Construction went ESOP. Talk to somebody that's done it so that you can get it from their mouth. Because sometimes they ask me and they're like, well, you're just trying to sell me an ESOP. I don't care if you do an ESOP or not personally. I just want to educate you about it. So I think educating yourself is step one.
And I would say get your financial house in order, meaning, I've seen small businesses that devalue, like I mentioned before, devalue their companies by the way they handle their books. There's stuff showing up on the P&L that should be on the balance sheet, et cetera. I've had clients like that before, and I'm like, I can't tell if you're making money or losing money. And so you need to, and my advice to them, because he was thinking about selling in 5 years, was to get your financials clean so you can accurately reflect what this company is actually valued at and what results you're actually achieving year over year, so that if you do decide to sell it and you go to a broker or something like that, that they can look at 3 to 5 years, 7 years of solid financials, and they reflect what the company is. And then also, when you're evaluating options, understand the financial aspect of that. You may need help on the financial modeling side of that, not only on the tax side, but when you think about like the example I gave earlier of this, selling to the brother, that worked for that company because they're so profitable that the company can fund the sale of the business over the years that he's going to work in the business, through his distributions. And so that works. That doesn't work in every organization. They may have to go out and get a loan or use their HELOC or who knows, right? Take a note out against the company, et cetera. But there's a lot of different things there, and an ESOP is a totally different animal as well. So I would just say on the financial side, you really need to understand that when evaluating options.
I would just say amen. We've already mentioned also make sure the corporate formalities are in place and current, so you don't get bogged down in some nitty-gritty corporate thing that only a lawyer would be interested in. Because at the time of a transaction, it's almost sometimes only lawyers who think that they're interesting. Actually, we always, I think think we're interesting. And then our theme seems to be, you got to start the conversation. If that's an owner quietly thinking to herself or himself, or that's a leadership team starting to discuss it, you got to start thinking about it and talking about it.
Yeah, and I know we'll go into some Q&A. Did you have anything you wanted to go over, Eric, as far as the sheet?
No.
Okay, that's fair. Does anybody have any questions for them in the panel specifically about what we've been talking about? Yeah, go ahead. As far as key employees and what their role can look like and how they can help in that development and that conversation.
Yeah, well, the first thing is I'm assuming that you know, like if the individual would know that this is happening, right? And if you are somebody that loves this company, loves your job, wants to be there, I first of all would engage the individuals in a one-on-one conversation just to talk to them and understand what is going on and what they really see, and hopefully you're going to get a good, honest answer. And what does this mean to me and my family moving forward? Because I really love this, this company, et cetera. And then how can I bring value through this process? Everybody needs to make an individual decision. It's hard to sit up here and go through every scenario in my mind. But if, let's say if it's a scenario where you just found out that you're selling and that's happening next month, and the new owners are going to come in and clean house, I'm probably getting my resume together, right? If this is a situation where the owner is transparent about this transition that's going to happen and how it's going to happen, I'm thinking to myself as an employee, how can I make myself a player in this situation and step up and really help transition and not foster gossip, et cetera, but actually be a champion in the process, right? Like in the Fiore situation, like if I look at that, and I'm a valued employee, I got to look at myself in the mirror and say, hey, how can I make this a success? Because I see the value long term, right? And how am I going to lead and show up for the other people in the organization?
I would just add, speak up. If you're a key employee, not an owner, but you have an interest, a future interest, a longer term interest in the organization, you need to let that ownership group or senior management team know that, so that you become part of the conversation, or so that you understand you won't be part of that conversation. But I have noticed sometimes when the transaction closes occasionally, there are individuals key in the organization who are like, we wanted a seat at that table. We would have worked to buy the business. This would have been interesting to us. No one ever asked, and so I think I've learned, don't wait for anybody to ask. If you have an interest, express it so that you can become part of the conversation.
Well, and a good business practice is to go through a strategic planning process, looking 3 to 5 years out. And your key leadership should be in the room. So whether you're an owner or not an owner, part of your strategy is about your people. What are we doing about our people? What are we doing about where are we moving the business? Are we going to expand geographically? What kind of numbers are we going to hit? And part of that, again, should be succession planning. So sometimes you have to use different words. Sometimes you say transition, and the guy's like, "What? You're going to kick my butt to the side? All you want is my job. You're going to kick me to the side, so I'm going to hang on to it." So, but a good strategic plan talks about what is our strategies going forward, and talking about how are we going to how do we need to prepare for this? We just don't want to. We don't want to have the hit by the bus syndrome. I used to say win the lottery. I don't know, so you can say whichever way you want. But, you can have your contingency plan, but let's not talk about just oh my gosh, we've had an emergency succession. Let's plan for it. Just like we plan everything else in our business, let's plan for this and let's have a conversation about it so that we can do it as a team. So sometimes it's not just focused on she's going to leave the business. Let's do it as a team. Let's talk about where this business is going to go and how we're going to transition it. So speak up. I like that.
Yeah. Anybody? Yeah, in the back.
Just to piggyback on that, I'm a business broker, and things that we'll see with key employees a lot is those conversations will get started with the owner. Maybe the owner starts that conversation, but then what happens is the owner is not very sure what they want to do. They can decide some years they want to sell, maybe they'll hang on 5 years, and then you have this key employee whose expectation is built around that they might be a part of this someday, and then the moment they sell to someone else, that key employee quits. So if you are a key employee, keeping that line of communication as open as much as you're able to, so that you can kind of understand where your boundaries are. If you're like, this isn't gonna happen, I need to know what my next plan, your resume, as they set up there. So continue to try and keep that, it's not on you, right? It's gonna be up to them in the end, but it is important to advocate for yourself in that and keep communication open, because almost all the time there is a key employee in place who has even talked about being an owner one day and then they end up not being, especially for a seller. If you're a seller and you're planning on that key employee being a part of the transaction, if they were part of that conversation and they are no longer looking at ownership, the chances of them leaving are very, very high.
Yeah. I mean, any additional comments on that?
Well, I think there's also something you have to understand. So, you know, if you're a GC or you're a mechanical engineering company, anything like that, you're doing what you're really good at, right? Most of the time, especially in a founder-run business, they were good at the business. They've never sold a company before. So they're nervous because they don't know what they don't know. And so, you know, again, that's why I think education is so important. And sometimes that founder has to go off and do it by themselves because they don't want you to see that they don't know the answer. They don't know what they're doing in this scenario. So they need a trusted advisor that can work with them. Sometimes it's got to be discreet because of their ego. And that could be a positive ego or a negative ego. But either way, they don't know how to do this. They've never done it before. So we just need to be sensitive to that in how we have the conversation. But we're all here to help them through that. So.
Yeah, what can the state do?
Yes, thank you. So my service at OED of economic development is volunteer work because we have a state that is leading the country in employee ownership transitions. So we have 5 pieces of legislation that we have gotten through. There are huge tax credits to help a company go through and transition at least 20% of your business, doesn't have to be 100%, to your employees. So there's 75% of your cost to convert up to $167,000 in a check the state will write to you. Brady, have they written the check yet?
Well, I haven't gotten all my paperwork.
You're getting the paperwork together. It's all about getting the paperwork together. But they will get a check written from the state of Colorado to help pay for your transition costs. Next thing that we've done is the first 7 years that greater than 20% of your employees own the business, the state will write you a check for $50,000 to help pay with your ongoing costs. So your administration, like you do with a 401k plan, whether you have a trustee, whether you have, you may have an audit done, you have to have a valuation done for your business every year, and so that covers a good chunk of the cost to be an employee-owned business. And then our latest is, and Libby's she's looking at me if I'm gonna get them all. The latest is that we passed when your owner sells, just like when you sell stock, you have to pay capital gains on the difference between what it costs you and what you sold it at. That's true whether you're talking Apple stock or Fiore stock. You have to pay capital gains. At the federal rate, it's 15%. We now have a waiver at the state rate at our rate was around 5%, that you no longer have to pay your state capital gains rate. So that just saved you almost 5% of the cost of your transaction. Starting 2027. Thank you. That's a new one. So yeah, so 2027. So our state is leading the country, and we have other states looking at what we're doing in this space because of those stats that you started with. So let's just say, you know, half of our small businesses are going to transition in the next 5 years. Half. In the state. That's a lot of businesses that are going to transition. And I believe the stats show that there's not enough buyers out there. And I'll say the conversations I have with the owners are they don't want a third party. They don't want somebody from out of state coming in to run their business. There's also about 70% of sellers that sell to a third party have seller's remorse within 5 years. And we don't see that as much in the employee ownership space. So maybe that's my little bit of my commercial for the employee ownership space. But thank you for that question because we have a lot of support out there. And you can talk to Libby or talk to me if you guys want to learn more about that.
Excellent. Well, and I think also an owner's going to value their business much higher. And then if there's key employees or who you're selling it to, it's do they have the capital, the collateral, the ability to go in? And so I think this is some of this strategic planning that you talk about, and how do we get them there? What does that transition look like? Because maybe by the time you start thinking about it enough, the business has grown so much and it's so valuable that the people that you'd love to sell it to don't have the ability, or what that looks like. So I think that's pretty valuable. Any other questions? Go for it. Yeah.
Yeah, great job so far, guys. You guys have really covered the business side of business exits. There's a big gap, though, that hasn't been addressed, and I just would love to get some ideas on that. And that's the personal wealth side of the owner. The owner's about to go through a massive wealth event, right? And if they don't prepare for that event personally, the tax bill is going to be enormous, upwards of like 30%, somewhere in there. And so you guys have information on that, thoughts, ideas on how owners should be protecting their personal wealth through these exits?
I'll just kick off with two quick thoughts. One is, of course, and a lot of investment banks and others have connections to family offices that will help the owner plan for exactly that, an extraordinary, life-changing infusion of capital, sometimes, hopefully. The other element of it is, and I don't want to get too far in the weeds, but tax planning as part of the transaction is critical. And once again, it depends on what we're doing and who we're doing it with. But it is not uncommon, for example, to go through a reorganization of the company simultaneous to the transaction to eliminate certain tax liabilities, and in some cases, all of them. What's interesting about that is the beneficiary of that tax strategy may be primarily the buyer, may be primarily the seller, or may be balanced. So it becomes a point of negotiation in the transaction. And what we frequently see, which I understand, is sellers' eyes glaze over when we get to the pages in the document that talk about tax strategy. And are we doing a tax qualified reorganization? They're like, yeah, whatever. When do I get the check? And it's like, we're talking about something that will have a material impact on what that looks like. So I would say there's two levels. There's the way the transaction is structured to maximize the flow of capital to the sellers while protecting the tax liability to the buyer. And then there's a second level, which is you need a good planner at some point, probably, to just help you understand, what do I do with this now?
And the other thing I'd suggest, and I think you mentioned it, was financial modeling, is looking at your net proceeds post-transaction. So what happens in an ESOP transaction, and like I just said, you save taxes on cap gains, you can do some other tax structuring, you might sell at a lower amount, but you could end up in a situation where your net proceeds are greater. But knowing the answer to that, or at least what's expected, working with somebody that can explain that to you in a way that you can understand and go through that process, because so many, I've seen situations where you sell because private equity or strategic gives you this higher price, but you didn't understand all the taxes. So at the end of the day, it was like, wait a minute. I mean, I think I'd say higher than 30%. You could have 40 to 45% of the proceeds go to Uncle Sam. So understanding what it takes to do that so you can plan.
Yeah, did you have one?
Yeah, I'm going to close with probably one question. And
Yeah.
so looking at the war for talent, and one of the highest cost of businesses is turnover and the cost of retraining, and that can vary from $10,000 maybe, probably much higher, to hundreds of thousands depending on the position of that individual. Do you have the stats on what the retention rates are for employee-owned companies versus not? Do you understand? Do you have a data on that?
We absolutely do, and the National Center for Employee Ownership does a lot of work in this space. So from a retention perspective and a turnover perspective, if you implement the employee ownership side of it, the ownership mindset that Brady talked about, not implementing an ESOP, employee ownership, yes, your turnover rates will be, I want to say the last stat I saw was like 20% less than your competition. That's a generalization. The other thing that we see is during the downturn economy, so if you go back to the Great Recession, 2008, some of us lived through that, employee-owned businesses had much less layoffs, or even during COVID, the employee-owned businesses laid off much fewer people. It was like 0 to 1% was the average for employee-owned businesses during COVID. So because of that, we're all in it together. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, because it does, because sometimes you still have to make good business decisions. It's not like kumbaya. It's not we're just here to, love one another. But you still have to make good business decisions. But in the employee ownership space, those are two stats I can tell you. And the third one I can give you is that your return on your investment in an employee-owned businesses, or how you perform compared to your competitors, is usually 6 to 10%. You'll outperform your competitors' bottom line by implementing the employee ownership mindset.
Great. No, and I threw this up there. I mean, Ian, thank you for the comment, because it's so deep and it's so vast that we didn't get into all the granular details of what it all means, because we could talk about it for hours. So I know this is one of the things we didn't even go to the different structures. Each person kind of touched on that. So there's always different the transaction ways and that you can do, and so it's going to be dependent upon each business and what makes the most sense from an ownership standpoint, and what you decide or what your company decides. And so, I mean, we threw this in there just as a graphic, but I thank you three for coming up with your really valuable expertise and insight.